Well, hello, darlings and lovers of the macabre. Welcome back to Musey's Modern Dreadfuls and Tales of Terror. Today, we are revisiting a longtime friend of the channel and personal friend, Bunny B03. Today, I will be sharing with you her bewitchingly spooky story, Last Rites. And away we go. Tears stung my weary eyes as they threatened to spill all over my face, but I couldn't give the residents of this hick town the satisfaction of my grief. It wasn't until the taste of copper filled the lining of my gums that I realized I'd been biting my lip to resist from screaming as they led my only child to the char-kissed fields. As hard as it was to watch my daughter Freya kick, bite, and scream, I wouldn't let myself look away. Tear tracks glistened on her otherwise dirty face as she called out for me, her mother, the person whose job it was to keep her safe at all costs, to protect her. The men at her sides yanked her by the throat and shoulders and hair as her body went limp in the defiance of her oncoming fate. Several posts of death stood scattered around the field. My heart dropped as they stopped at the one closest to me. Freya's hands were forcefully wrenched behind the post and tied with thick strands of rope. She stiffened in silence once the final rope was finally secured around her neck. I couldn't tell if it was out of resignation or shock. Hateful jeers and callous laughter rang out as her bare feet began to slip on the pile of logs and straw beneath her. Villagers threw bits of rotted food and stones at her already battered body. Freya was silent, and I was thankful to see that her eyes were closed. I didn't think I could handle seeing the abject terror on her face in those last moments. The crowd parted as a third man sauntered to where my daughter was standing in wait, like an unwilling lamb to be slaughtered. He looked her up and down before spitting on her bloodied feet. He kissed the torch to the logs beneath her, and before long, terrified shrieks pierced the night air as flames licked the bottom of her toes. Emotion overtook me as tears flowed freely for my beloved child. I backed away, wringing my hands in sorrow. Summoning all of my courage and strength that I could muster, I lifted my hands to my trembling mouth and began to whisper last rites. I repeated them incessantly, increasing in volume until they came out in thunderous torrents of commands. No one paid me any attention or even looked my way, my words still hidden in the underlying wind of Freya's screams. I waited until they were gathered close, eager to feast on the energy of an innocent girl's death, to say the last word. As it bellowed through the air, fire shot from the logs. Villagers and lawmen alike screamed in horror as flames traveled up their bodies, invading their airways and cooking their flesh. Freya sobbed gratefully as I dislodged her from what was destined to be the site of her murder. I carried her all the way home, safe and loved where she belonged. Don't you go anywhere. You know what we like to do. When I have a short story, obviously I have a secondary story to share with you. And this one is an exclusive only for Musey's Modern Dreadfuls, written by my good friend, personal friend, and great author, Bunny B03. This one is called Halloween, the season where anything is possible. There were only a dozen or more houses on our street last Halloween. and only 2 of them contained families with children. Chuck Murphy had twin boys named Aaron and Brian. They were 7 years old and were creepily well behaved for kids their age. I imagined at one time there was a Mrs. Murphy, but she was certainly nowhere to be found at that point. Then there was us, the whole family. My husband Blaine and I had been raising our daughter Caprice, who at the time was a 10-year-old bundle of curiosity and intelligence. Our not-so-little girl, who just 2 years ago wanted to be a pink princess for Halloween, decided she wanted to go as a Necromancer last year. One hooded cloak, black dress, a skull pendant, and dark lipstick later, and she was good to go. We normally went trick-or-treating together with the other neighborhood kids, but Blaine had to work late at the emergency veterinary clinic that night, so I didn't have the pleasure of his company. People do some seriously messed up shit to animals on Halloween, especially to black cats. Anyway, Caprice was more than old enough to walk at the front of the group, so I decided to hang back with Chuck. His boys' costumes were very well put together. Aaron wore a vampire's cloak. His hair was slicked back with what smelled like baby oil, and 2 fangs sat perched on his front canines. Brian was wrapped head to toe in tattered gauze, spending his evening as an Egyptian mummy. They received quite the haul, with there only being a dozen or so houses on our street. Our weary-footed, sleepy-eyed children trudged back to our houses with bulging bags of candy, dragging a bare trail through the dirt and the leaves. It wasn't until 7 o'clock the next morning that Blaine and I heard the scream. Caprice flew down the stairs from her bedroom, eyes wild with concern.
"What's going on?"
she asked in alarm, running past me to the front door. "Wait!" I shouted, to no avail. Chuck was screaming in agony in his front yard. 2 small, broken bodies laid in the grass before him. Brian, the smaller of the 2, looked like his body was centuries old. Tattered scraps of discarded gauze flapped around his dust-infested face. Aaron's body was charred, still smoldering with acrid-smelling smoke. "Holy shit, Chuck! What the hell happened here?" I screamed. The putrid smell filled my airways the moment I stepped onto my front lawn. I ran to my daughter's side, who was trembling next to Chuck's mailbox as her eyes grew wide in horror. "They're costumes!" Chuck wailed. "Brian fell asleep in his costume. By the time we tried to take it off this morning, he turned to fucking dust. His blood evaporated right in my hands." I knelt down to console him, trying to hide the sickening look on my face. It was coming from my gut, from the smell. "Aaron," he continued, "my boy burst into flames the second his skin was exposed to the sun." I looked to Caprice, mortified and heartbroken. She surprisingly stepped forward and placed her hands on the bodies, impervious to the heat of Aaron's burning flesh. Her eyes burned white and began to glow as energy coursed through her body.
"Vita!"
she said as she collapsed in exhaustion as Brian's brittle bones rose and fell back to the ground.
"I tried, Mama. But it's too late," she sobbed.
Her cries were soon drowned out by the sirens of ambulances, police cars, and fire trucks attending to the scene. After answering a few questions, I wasn't needed anymore. After all, I hadn't seen anything until it was all over with, so I was little to no help to the situation. I guided Caprice inside, still suffering from the maelstrom of emotions. Blaine gave her something to help her sleep and walked her up to bed. I had no idea how to explain to him what my daughter and I had just experienced. Our daughter awoke groggily the next morning, seemingly with no recollection of the night before. She knew that the neighbors' boys were gone, but mentioned nothing of her actions or the effect she had on Brian's remains. There were no instances of anything out of the ordinary for most of the rest of the year. So, the reason I bring this all up now is that Halloween is near. When the light is just right, she looks at Blaine's pictures. I catch a glow in her eyes. What's worse? We buried him little more than a month ago, after passing away unexpectedly. I find myself becoming increasingly distant and fearful of my daughter. She hasn't been able to achieve any results through summoning her father through photographs. But what happens when she figures out she has to go right to the source? And yippee-ki-yay, Musey lovers! I do hope you enjoyed the two wonderfully bewitching tales written by Bunny BO3. One is an exclusive just for Musey's Modern Dreadfuls. So, thank you very much to my friend Bunny BO3. And yes, we are getting near to Halloween. I don't know what you folks are doing. I hope you don't go to a big party and get yourself sick. I'm having a party with my two very little muses. I mean, they're elementary age. So it's a bummer to not be able to trick or treat, but it's more of a bummer to have one of your parents or one of your siblings die. Yes. So you all stay happy and have a great Halloween. More Spooktober type things will be showing up. And thank you so much. See you soon. Love to you all. Bye now.